Steve Bryant, resolution.
Thanks very much, Mr Gray. I beg to move that this House has considered the role of early years educators. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, sir. Looking around me, I also see many friends and many supporters of our early years sector. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to come and debate this issue with us this afternoon. I know there's a lot of competing important issues going on in Parliament today. Let me start with two declarations of interest. Firstly, I am married to a hard-working early years educator who will be arriving home very shortly to pick up the school run and then juggle all the different things which working mums do while working dads are in Parliament, or vice versa. Secondly, for the last couple of years, it's been my pleasure to chair the all-party group for childcare and early education. We held our AGM in the last hour, actually, Mr Gray, and I want to extend my thanks to parliamentary colleagues who supported our work over the last year and have committed to do so for the year ahead. I was somehow re-elected chairman of the group for the next year. I also want to thank many colleagues, old and new, who've agreed to serve as officers for the coming year. We have much to do. The debate that we had this afternoon is timely. It rather wonderfully coincides with the all-party group's annual Childcare and Early Education Week, which celebrates and promotes the hard work of our early years educators and our sector. Our theme for this year is actually celebrating the role of that early years workforce as educators, which is what I wanted to place at the heart of my chairmanship of the group, and seeking to explore the challenges that they face and obviously celebrate the good work that they do. Last week, the all-party group held a forum for parents, Mr Gray, to share their experiences of early years educators and settings that they're involved with. It was chaired by the brilliant Professor Cathy Silver of Oxford University. Professor Silver is actually providing an update to the meeting of our all-party group at this very moment, which is being chaired by the Father of the House in my absence because I'm standing here. The session is being recorded, and any colleagues who would like to catch up on that, I would ask them to follow it up on our social media channels. There were some incredible examples provided by parents that I see as an example of very best work that we can do here in Westminster. I'm sure Professor Silver will not mind me touching upon some of the things that were said. One parent spoke about the empathy, the patience, the humour an early years educator shows when working with both herself and her child with significant SEND issues. Another reminded us of the little freedoms that early years settings empower families to have. One lady said she actually occasionally has lunch with her partner, which may sound frivolous, but actually one of the best things we can do for our children is to provide them with a loving, secure home environment. And making sure that mum and dad stay mum and dad is rather important too, actually. So one phrase that touched me was the parent who said this of the key worker in their child's early years setting. Simply, we'd be lost without these people. They're truly amazing. And I wanted to quote those for the record today. Now, of course, there are areas for development in the early years workforce as we strive for the continued betterment of it. At our forum, parents raised issues of setting opening hours and overwhelmingly the need to ensure early years educators are properly paid, a subject that I will return to. Now, I commend the government for acting on this issue in the spending review. Following a meeting that my honourable friend sitting next to me, the member for Bury North and myself had with the Chancellor early this year, he placed early years at the centre of some of his announcements in this area in the budget, and he quadrupled the funding going into early years settings over the next 3 years. This was, of course, most welcome, Mr Gray, and an important step towards shoring up a sector that has been heavily hit, it is fair to say, during the pandemic. However, as I've said before, this is simply not just about money. The early years sector is facing an existential crisis as settings are being forced to close, and valued at the early years educators that we're talking about are then lost to other lines of work, often due to remuneration. Most worryingly of all, bright young prospects are being put off a career as an early years educator. At a meeting of our all-party group in December, 2 apprentices spoke compellingly about their work with children under 5. However, their brilliant talents were pursuing careers in social care and not in early years. Now, of course, social care is an important vocation, but they're a great loss to the potential early years workforce of tomorrow and how we need them. So more must be done to draw the early years educators of tomorrow towards the profession, not to push them away. And let me give way to my predecessor as chair of the All Party Group.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way, and I know he's a doughty champion for the early years sector, and I've heard him mention his wife on several occasions and admire the work that she does. In an ideal world, I would have stayed and made a speech in the debate. I've got to leave because I've moved on from my brief to the Shadow Treasury team and I've got a commitment. But I felt I wanted to come and pay tribute to the early years educators, and I'm so pleased he uses the term educators because they are educators. They're not just key workers, but also they are the unsung heroes of our nation and make a massive difference to our children's life chances. He mentions the amounts that they're paid. I think he's quite mentioned how much they're paid, but on average, as he knows, it's only £7.42 per hour that they're paid, which is dismal if you compare it to how much it costs to live. But I also wonder if you could comment on the fact that we actually need a cultural change in how we value and talk about early years practitioners and educators, and don't just refer to early years sector as childcare, but also refer to them as educators. Talk about it as early education as well. Sorry, could go on about this forever.
And I thank her for that. It's funny how often in my almost 12 years in this House, people say, it's amazing, I was just about to come onto that in my speech. And funnily enough, I was. And she led on this when she led the All-Party Group, and she's absolutely right. I think for far too often, we have seen early years practitioners presented as well-meaning amateurs who are good at changing and plasticine, when actually they're good at that as well, but they're also educators. And so she's absolutely right. So following on from what she said, I think a major contributing factor to the fact that we are losing people from the profession and not attracting them into it is that early years educators have been subject to so many misconceptions about their role that has affected how their profession is viewed and then how it can attract. Firstly, and most commonly, is the notion that early years educators somehow don't hold the same status as those also working in the other subsequent parts of the education profession. This, Mr. Gray, could not be further from the truth. The first few years of early education from the foundation on which is the foundation on which lifelong learning, health and well-being are built. Handling this phase of a child's life requires specialist knowledge and specialist approaches from trained, qualified practitioners. So early years educators are these highly trained professionals, and they hold specialist qualifications accordingly. Despite this, many settings are struggling to pay competitive salaries, and providers have therefore reported that staff increasingly moving into sectors like retail. Yes.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I congratulate him on this important debate, and I apologise that I can't stay for the full debate either. But on this point about pay, isn't it linked to the fact that so many providers simply cannot cover the cost of their staff and their settings with the amount that they get from the government for the so-called free hours of childcare, the 15 hours universal for 3- and 4-year-olds and the 15 hours additional? We can have a whole debate whether somebody like me should be entitled to those hours, which is a separate point. But I speak from experience as the mother of a 3-year-old who's only getting 27 hours of childcare a week, yet I'm still paying half of what I was before he turned 3. They simply can't make ends meet, and that's why they can't pay staff properly, they can't train them well enough.
Yeah, no, I think she's right, and I would go on to say that, I mean, early year settings that we hear from in the group report that funding for the hours offered under the flagship 30 hours entitlement, which of course I support, have not kept pace with the rise of minimum wage and all the other costs. And so the cost of providing each hour versus the cost of what comes in, that gap has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and the line's crossed. And that's why we're then seeing the squeeze that we're seeing, and that's why we're seeing setting closing. So I thank you for that point. So competitive pay is the least any qualified profession should expect. And I hope the funding announcement in the spending review, which I mentioned, will help address this. However, the pandemic has added to the stress of us all. It's added to the stress of skilled staff, including with the increased risk of exposure to infection that our early years professionals face. And a loss of skilled staff means that the early years sector cannot deliver the high-quality early education which will especially affect the most deprived areas and the most disadvantaged children. So I just wanted to stress that point to the Minister. I know that he's acutely aware of it, and I hope he can address it in his closing remarks. So I think the early years workforce needs a step change in wages. The government have gone far, but I think it needs to go further. The Minister has my full support to take up our cause inside government, and we will back him all the way. I know, as being a former junior minister in the Health Department, that it is sometimes the case that parliamentary undersecretaries of state do not have the swing vote inside decisions in Her Majesty's Treasury, which is why he will need all the ballast that we can provide, and I think that I speak for all of us in this room to say that we are there to provide it. So urgency in addressing this area is underlined by my next point. Most places in the early years sector are delivered through private, voluntary or independent childcare settings. Now, maintained nurseries, I have lanterns in my constituency, play a vital role too, but the PVI providers deliver over 80% of childcare places, and they have a consistently good reputation across the board. Like their maintained counterparts, PVI settings are overseen by Ofsted, which is good. Indeed, in 2020, Ofsted ranked 96% of PVI providers as good or outstanding, up from 72% in 2012. And most of these providers, about 57% of them, Mr Gray, have only one site. So only 9% of PVI providers are what we would call a chain with 20 or more sites. So most of these settings are hard-working small businesses that employ people exclusively from the local community. They invest any surplus that they have in upgrading the nursery environments and, crucially, developing their most important asset, their staff. Now, we're not talking about people lining their pockets with these ever-dwindling surpluses. They're simply seeking to make a fair living whilst pursuing that brilliant vocation of shaping young lives. And that brings me to my next point. You heard earlier the story of how one parent and their child benefited from the support offered by their early years educator, their inspiration. And this is a tale replicated time and again across the country, and I suspect other members will refer to it. Early years educators provide support, advice and guidance to parents, to caregivers and to families, including on nutrition, on play, on schooling and on health. So they are educators in the widest possible sense of the word, and they often form great teams with parents and provide families with valuable insights into their child's development. We know children from multiple attachments, form multiple attachments at an early age, and one of these can be down to those working with them in their nursery settings. Crucially, as policymakers, I think we all understand the importance of early intervention to make a difference to life chances. For every £1 invested in early education, about £7 would be required in adolescence to have the same impact. So for every £1 invested in early years, saves about £13 in later interventions. One parent and NHS worker captured it best when they said this to me. Whilst nurses, doctors and other healthcare staff get most of the accolades, rightly so, early years settings and their workers selflessly continue to open to look after key worker children such as ours, even though it potentially put them at risk, so that we could continue to work. There were press reports at the end of last year of adjusting staffing roles in early years settings as part of an aim to lower the cost for parents. I would gently caution the Minister against this. I think safe, secure, necessary monitoring in early years settings requires a higher staffing ratio than in school. And leading voices from across the early years sector, including the Early Years Alliance and the National Day Nurseries Association, have warned against this. Early years professionals, in my opinion, deserve pension contributions and pay increases that can keep in line with increases in the cost of living, a very hot, of course, political subject at the moment. This must be delivered through more investment and better recognition of the work of the early years workforce. So we're in a position where government requires early years settings to be open to deliver the 30-hour funding entitlement, but as I've said, there's a shortfall in funding, and that can only go on so long. The result is that many settings are running at a loss. They're facing closure, especially in the disadvantaged areas. Now, as a Conservative, I want small businesses, and I mentioned how many of them are small businesses, of course, to thrive, and I believe every member in the House on all sides would want this. As a parent, I want all children to have access to the very best early education wherever they live. In the case of PVI early years settings, the two are not mutually exclusive. Those who pursue a career in early years education do so above all else because they believe passionately in making a difference in children's lives. And this is because early years educators are vital in tackling inequalities. We know that the first 5 years of a child's life are the most formative. But when providers in the most deprived areas report themselves twice as likely to close than those in more affluent areas, we've got to acknowledge that there's something going seriously wrong here. The Early Years Alliance has said that poorer families are more likely to lose access to early years settings because of what I've described as a market failure. I'm sure that their colleagues will speak to other experiences from their area, but I think it's important to set the context. If we deliver on our promises and level up all parts of the country, Mr. Gray, that have been left behind, the early years workforce, I would suggest, is a vital tool in that. So what can we do? We can begin squaring the circle here today by supporting the all-party group, our call for early years workforce to take their rightful place as educators. I would encourage colleagues to take advantage of the relaxation of restrictions to meet with local early educator providers in their area. I'm sure everybody in this debate does, and we can all show our support that they do by thanking them during the debate today. However, it is to the Minister that I look, and I've sat in his seat many times. He's most welcome to his post, which I know he's still relatively new in. I hope we can find time to come and speak to us on the all-party group in short time. We know there's a lot in the Minister's in tray, but we also know that he's a parent, and no doubt a lot of what I have touched on today will resonate with him. I just need to qualify, coming to my conclusion, Mr. Gray, one point that I made earlier when I said it's not all about money. I meant it, but so many of the challenges facing early years educators can be addressed by more targeted investment. We must address the workforce challenge that our early years sector is facing. This can only be done, in my opinion, by paying our early years educators the same as those working with reception year group. The present system is inequitable and it's unfair. I think this change would be transformative to our valued early years workers. That is the cornerstone of what this government can do to deliver for our early years professionals and the families they support. However, extra cash will be meaningless unless it is accompanied by this wider transformation I spoke about of how we view the early years workforce. It's a problem best encapsulated by the fact that they are highly skilled, but they are low-paid professionals. We trust them with our most precious resources, our children, in the very, very early years of their life when so much attachment is formed. I think it's only right that we view them as what they are, which is educators. Thank you very much, Mr. Gray.